XXVI. Back to London and a tour of the continent. On April 15, 1896, Swami Vivekananda left New York for London. A pleasant surprise awaited him there. Swami Saradananda had arrived from Calcutta on 1st April and was the guest of Mr. E. T. Sturdy. For several years the Swami had not seen any of the Guru Bhais. So his meeting with Swami Saradananda was an event of great joy. Swami Saradananda brought all the news from India. He told his brother monk about the monastery in Alambazar and of every one of the Guru Bhais. The Swami was full of plans at the time, which he communicated to his brother monk, who was lost in wonder at his indefatigable energy and his apostolic fervor. The Swami himself foresaw the success that lay before him on his second visit to England. All who had known him during his previous sojourn in London welcomed him back most cordially. Together with Swami Saradananda, he made his home in St. George's Road as the guest of Miss Muller and Mr. Sturdy. Soon he found himself teaching privately and preaching publicly, and the fame of his personality and utterances travelled wide. In a short time many persons of distinction, students of comparative religion and earnest seekers after truth were visiting his quarters, and he was introduced to many new people who became his followers. He talked to them of the philosophies of India and their relation to modern life and explained to them the various forms of yoga, and gathered round him a considerable number of people desirous of seriously studying the problem of human existence in their light. In the beginning of May 1896, the Swami began his regular classes, lecturing mostly on Jnana Yoga, or the path of wisdom. Towards the end of May, he inaugurated a series of Sunday lectures in one of the galleries of the Royal Institute of Painters in Watercolours in Piccadilly. The subjects were the necessity of religion, a universal religion, and the real and the apparent man. These three lectures proving a great success, another course was arranged for in Prince's Hall for Sunday afternoons from the end of June to the middle of July. Among these lectures were Bhakti Yoga, Renunciation and Realization. Besides these, the Swami held regularly every week 5 classes at which the attendance was uniformly good, and on Friday evenings a question and answer class, which was especially educative. In his first series of class lectures, he dealt mainly with the history of the Aryan race, its developments, its religious advance, and the diffusion of its religious influence. Besides his class lectures on Jnana Yoga, he gave a course of lessons on Raja Yoga. Then followed a series of discourses on Bhakti Yoga. Shorthand reports of these lectures were taken down by Mr. Goodwin. But all these classes and Sunday lectures and interviews did not by any means cover the whole of the work the Swami was doing in England. He lectured also in many drawing rooms and at several well-known clubs. At the invitation of Mrs. Annie Besant, he spoke at her lodge in Avenue Road, St. John's Wood, on Bhakti. He also delivered an address on the Hindu idea of soul at the residence of Mrs. Martin. The Swami also spoke at Notting Hill Gate at the residence of Mrs. Hunt, as well as at Wimbledon, when a good deal of helpful discussion followed the lecture and several other meetings of a similar nature were arranged for. At the Sesame Club, he delivered an address on education. Swami Saradananda, writing to the Brahmavadin of 6th June, says, Swami Vivekananda has made a good beginning here. A large number of people attend his classes regularly, and the lectures are most interesting. Canon Hoyes, one of the leaders of the Anglican Church, came the other day and was much interested. He had seen the Swami before at the Chicago Fair and loved him from that time. On Tuesday last the Swami lectured on education at the Sesame Club. It is an important club organized by women for the education of their sex. In this he dealt with the old educational systems of India, pointed out clearly and impressively that the sole aim of the system was man-making and not cramming, and compared it with the present system. The Swami was warmly received at the residence of Canon Wilberforce, where a levee was held in his honor, in which many distinguished ladies and gentlemen took part. Mr. Eric Hammond, in recording his reminiscences of the Swami's visit to London and especially of a lecture before a club, says, "On his arrival in London, Swami Vivekananda was welcomed in the quiet, thoughtful, semi-calculating way to which Londoners generally habituate themselves. Perhaps the missionary, everywhere, is met by an atmosphere not exactly antagonistic, but, at the best, doubtful. That Swamiji recognized this clement of doubt and of wonderment is certain, and it is certain too that his winning personality cleared a way through it and found glad welcome in many hearts. Clubs, societies, drawing rooms opened their doors to him. Sets of students grouped themselves together in this quarter and that, and heard him at appointed intervals. His hearers, hearing him, longed to hear further. At one of these meetings, at the close of his address, a white-haired and well-known philosopher said to the Swami, "You have spoken splendidly, sir, and I thank you heartily, but you have told us nothing new." The lecturer's sonorous tones rang through the room in reply, "Sir, I have told you the truth. That, the truth, is as old as the immemorial hills, as old as humanity, as old as the creation, as old as the great God. If I have told it in such words as will make you think, make you live up to your thinking, do I not do well in telling it?" The murmur of "Hear, hear," and the louder clapping of hands showed how completely the Swami had carried his audience with him. One lady present on that occasion, and on many more, said, "I have attended church services regularly all Rui life. Their monotony and lack of vitality had made them barren and distasteful. I went to them because others went, and one hates to be peculiar. Since I heard the Swami, light has flooded into religion. It is real, it lives, it lias a new glad meaning, and is altogether transformed for me." I will tell you how, came to know the truth, continued the Swami, and in the telling they learned something of the earth life of Sri Ramakrishna, the sublime simplicity of his character, his indefatigable search for truth in this religion's phase, and that, his discovery and his fine proclamation of it, "Where I am, there the truth is." "I found truth," said the Swami, "because I had it in my heart already. Do not deceive yourselves. Do not imagine you will find it in one creed or in another creed. It is within you. Your creed will not give it to you, you must give it to your creed. Men and priests give it various names. They bid you believe one thing and another thing. Listen, you have it within yourself, this pearl of great price. That which exists is one. Listen, thou art that." From first to last of this address lie dwelt on the message of his master, Sri Ramakrishna. He had, he said, not one little word of his own to utter, not one infinitesimal thought of his own to unfold. Every asterisk thing, every single thing, all he was himself, all lie could be to us, all he might be to the world, came from that single source, from the pure soul, from the illimitable inspiration who, seated there in my beloved India, had solved the tremendous secret and bestowed the solution broadcast, ungrudgingly, with divine prodigality. In passages of exquisite eloquence, he dilated upon Sri Ramakrishna. Self was utterly forgotten, altogether ignored. I am what I am. And what I am is always due to him, whatever in me or in any words is good and true and eternal came to me from his mouth, his heart, his soul. Sri Ramakrishna is the spring of this phase of the earth's religious life, of its impulses and its activities. If I can show the world one glimpse of my master, I shall not live in vain. Asterisk. One cannot read the above eloquent tribute of the Swami to his master without noting a beautiful phase of his character, how even in the midst of his triumphs, when he was himself hailed on all sides as master, he again and again pointed out in all humility that he was only a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna at whose feet he had learned everything, that the credit of his teaching was not his but was due to his master. It is only a true disciple that can be a true master. The Indian students resident in London naturally looked to him for guidance. The Swami endeared himself to them all by making them feel quite at home with him and helping them in various ways. And so when on 18th July, a social conference of Indian residents in Great Britain and Ireland was held under the auspices of the London Hindu Association, it was he who was asked to preside. The subject of the discourse was the Hindus and their needs. At this meeting many English ladies and gentlemen were present. The Swami worked indefatigably in these days, even more than he had done during his previous visit. It must be noted that even at that time, in the midst of his multifarious activities, he had devoted a good deal of his time in helping Mr. Sturdy in his translation of the Nradradasutras on Bhakti Yoga. The book, which was published about this time, with copious commentaries by the Swami, was deservedly popular. One of the memorable events during the Swami's stay in London was his meeting with the celebrated Orientalist, Professor Max Muller of Oxford University, at his residence, by special invitation, on 28th May. Of that pleasant experience the Swami himself wrote as follows to the Brahmavadin on 6th June. What an extraordinary man is Professor Max Muller. I paid a visit to him a few days ago. I should say that I went to pay my respects to him, for whosoever loves Sri Ramakrishna, whatever be his or her sect, or creed, or nationality, my visit to that person I hold as a pilgrimage. The professor was first induced to inquire about the power behind, which led to sudden and momentous changes in the life of the late KCS Hab Chandra Sen, the great Brahmo leader, and since then, he has been an earnest student and admirer of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna is worshipped by thousands today, Professor, I said. To whom else shall worship be accorded, if not to such, was his answer. The professor was kindness itself, and asked Mr. Sturdy and myself to lunch with him. He showed us several colleges in Oxford, and the Bodleian Library. He also accompanied us to the railway station, and all this he did because, as he said, it is not every day one meets with a disciple of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. The visit was really a revelation to me. That nice little house, its setting of a beautiful garden, the silver-headed sage, with a face calm and benign, and forehead smooth as a child's in spite of 70 winters, and every line in that face speaking of a deep-seated mine of spirituality somewhere behind, that noble wife, the helpmate of his life through his long and arduous task of exciting interest, overriding opposition and contempt, and at last creating a respect for the thoughts of the sages of ancient India, the trees, the flowers, the calmness and the clear sky, all these sent me back in imagination to the glorious days of ancient India, the days of our Brahmarslis and Rajarshis, the days of the great Vanaprasthas, the days of Arundhatis and Vasishthas. It was neither the philologist nor the scholar that I saw, but a soul that is every day realizing its oneness with the Brahman, a heart that is every moment expanding to reach oneness with the universal. And what love he bears towards India! I wish I had 100th part of that love for my own motherland. Endued with an extraordinary, and at the same time, an intensely active mind, he has lived and moved in the world of Indian thought for 50 years or more, and watched the sharp interchange of light and shade in the interminable forest of Sanskrit literature with deep interest and heartfelt love, till they have all sunk into his very soul and colored his whole being. Max M. Tiller is a Vedanist of Vedantists. When are you coming to India? Every heart there would welcome one who has done so much to place the thoughts of their ancestors in the true light, I said. The face of the aged sage brightened up, there was almost a tear in his eye, a gentle nodding of the head, and slowly the words came out, I would not return then, you would have to cremate me there. Further questions seemed an unwarrantable intrusion into realms wherein are stored the holy secrets of man's heart. This letter was written by the Swami shortly after the professor had written an article, From Information Gathered in India concerning Sri Ramakrishna, which was to appear in the 19th century entitled A Real Mahatma. Out of the enthusiasm with which the Swami had inspired him, he asked, what are you doing to make him known to the world? He was anxious to know more concerning the Master and said that he would be glad to write a large and fuller account of his life and teaching, provided ampler facts and details were given him. The Swami at once commissioned Swami Sardananda to get into communication with India and to collect as much as was possible of the sayings of Sri Ramakrishna and of the facts concerning his life. This was done, and the professor set to work at once and nibbled them in a book which has been published under the title, Ramakrishna, His Life and Sayings. This book breeds a fervid devotional and yet critical spirit, and contains a number of the Master's sayings. It has aided materially in giving the Swami and his mission a firmer hold on the English-speaking world. The Swami and the professor were frequent correspondents and fast friends. Only in matters of philosophical criticism did they sometimes differ. The Swami was in the highest spiritual moods during his stay in London. Oftentimes he was all radiance and ecstasy, with infinite love and sympathy for everybody and everything, and nothing better illustrates this than a letter dated 6th July, which he addressed to Mr. Francis H. Leggett in the endearing term of frankincense, and which reads as follows. Things are going on with me very well on this side of the Atlantic. The Sunday lectures were quite successful. So were the classes. The season has ended and I too am thoroughly exhausted. I am going to make a tour in Switzerland with Miss Muller. Well, the work is growing silently yet surely in England. Almost every other man or woman came to me and talked about the work. This British Empire with all its drawbacks is the greatest machine that ever existed for the dissemination of ideas. I mean to put my ideas in the center of this machine, and they will spread all over the world. Of course, all great work is slow and the difficulties are too many, especially as we Hindus are the conquered race. Yet, that is the very reason why it is bound to work, for spiritual ideals have always come from the downtrodden. Jews overwhelmed the Roman Empire with their spiritual ideals. You will be pleased to know that I am also learning my lessons every day in patience and, above all, in sympathy. I think I am beginning to see the divine, even inside the haughty Anglo-Indians. I think I am slowly approaching to that state when I would be able to love the very devil himself, if there were any. At 20 I was the most unsympathetic, uncompromising fanatic. I would not walk on the footpath on the theatre side of the streets in Calcutta. At 33 I can live in the same house with prostitutes and never would think of saying a word of reproach to them. Is it degenerate? Or is it that I am broadening out into that universal love which is the Lord Himself? Again, I have heard that if one dogs not seek the evil around one cannot do good work, one lapses into a sort of fatalism. I do not see that. On the other hand, my power of work is immensely increasing and becoming immensely effective. Some days I get into a sort of ecstasy. I feel that I must bless everyone, everything, love and embrace everything, and I do see that evil is a delusion. I am in one of these moods now, dear Francis, and am actually shedding tears of joy at the thought of your and Mrs. Leggett's love and kindness to me. I bless the day I was born. I have had so much of kindness and love here, and that love infinite that brought me into being has guarded every one of my actions, good or bad. Don't be frightened. For what am I? What was I ever but a tool in His hands, for whose service I have given up everything, my beloved ones, any joy, my life. He is my playful darling, I am His playfellow. There is neither rhyme nor reason in the universal. What reason binds Him? He, the playful one, is playing these tears and laughters over all parts of the play. Great fun, as Joe says. It is a funny world, and the funniest chap you ever saw is He, the beloved infinite. Fun, is it not? Brotherhood or playmatehood, a school of romping children let out to play in this playground of the world. Isn't it? Whom to praise, whom to blame, it is all His play. They want explanations, but how can you explain Him? He is brainless, nor has He any reason. He is fooling us with little brains and reason, but this time He won't find me napping. I have learnt a thing or two beyond reason, and learning and talking is the feeling, the love, the beloved star. I, sake, fill up the cup and we will be mad. Yours ever in madness, Vivekananda. Here one has Swami Vivekananda himself. We see him in a mood almost akin to the ecstasy of Saint Francis of Assisi, or bordering on that divine madness which possessed the Sufis of old, as he speaks of his beloved Lord. But returning to a consideration of the Swami's work, it will be hard to gauge the import and character of it and the interest it created in London. It was more spiritual than organized. Many ministers of the gospel and distinguished clergymen were caught up in the grandeur and the freshness of the thought he sent forth. Distinguished intellectual and society people were captivated until it seemed as if some great movement was about to be born in his name. He conferred the spirit, leaving the form to be organized later, in whatsoever way it might be possible. He often said of himself that he was not an organizer, but a preacher and a monk, and it is in this sense that his work in England must be regarded. But apart from the public significance of the Swami's work in London, his second visit is memorable, for he made then some of the most valuable contacts of his life and gathered to his fold some of the most diligent and heroic workers and helpers in his cause. True, in his previous visit he had made acquaintances which ripened into friendship with such talented souls as Miss Henrietta Muller, Miss M. E. Noble, Mr. E. T. Sturdy and others, but now they became his disciples, ready to sacrifice everything for him and his cause. To this group were added two of his most faithful disciples, Mr. and Mrs. Sevier, of whom we shall often have occasion to speak later. Mr. and Mrs. Sevier met Swamiji soon after his arrival in London, having heard from a mutual friend that a Hindu preacher was going to hold classes on Eastern philosophy. Both of them were earnest students of religion and sought for the highest truth in various sects and creeds, but none of these satisfied the yearning of their souls. They were disappointed with the forms and theological dogmas which passed under the name of religion. So it was with expectant hearts that they came to listen to the exposition of a new religion from the lips of an Indian yogi. What was the surprise of the devoted couple to find on comparing notes that they, when hearing the Swami, had felt intuitively and simultaneously thus, "This is the man and this is the philosophy that we have been seeking in vain all through our life." What appealed to them most was the Advait philosophy. The very first time they met the Swami in private, the latter addressed Mrs. Sevier as mother and asked her, "Would you not like to come to India? I will give you of my best realizations." From that day they looked upon the Swami not only as their Guru but as their own son. Thus was established a relationship which was to bring forth inestimable fruits in the fulfillment of one of the Swami's great missions to the West. Indeed, he held Miss Noble, Sister Nivedita, J. Goodwin and Mr. and Mrs. Sevier as the fairest flowers of his work in England. Exhausted with the strenuous exertions of his London work, the Swami accepted the invitation of 3 of his more intimate friends for a tour and a holiday on the continent. He was as delighted as a child at the prospect. Those who planned the Swami's holiday and accompanied him on his tour were Mr. and Mrs. J. H. Sevier and Miss Henrietta Muller. For some time, they had been urging the Swami to rest, for they felt that he could not endure much longer the strain of his work. Then, too, it was the holiday season for London in general, and many of the Swami's students and admirers were leaving the metropolis for seaside or mountain resorts. When the suggestion was made to him, the Swami readily assented. He was particularly eager to visit Switzerland. He said, "Oh, I long to see the snows and wander on the mountain paths." So in the afternoon of one of the last days in July, the Swami and his friends left London with the best wishes of all his students and disciples. Arriving at Dover, the party took passage to Calais. The English Channel, often choppy, chanced on this occasion to be comparatively calm. In order to break the long journey between Calais and Geneva, the travelers spent the night in Paris. On the following day, they resumed their journey, arriving in excellent spirits at Geneva. The hotel in which the party found accommodation overlooked the beautiful and peaceful lake. The cool, invigorating air, the intense blue of the waters, the sky and the fields, the picturesqueness of the houses, and the novelty of things about him deeply appealed to the Swami. Geneva is a great bathing resort, and the Swami availed himself twice of the opportunity for full water bathing. A visit to the castle of Chillo ended a 3 days sojourn in this historic city. They originally intended to remain longer, but the program was suddenly changed, and we next find the travelers in the far-famed retreat of Chamonix, some 40 miles away. When they approached this place, the grand spectacle of Mont Blanc opened up to view, presenting a vision which the Swami said he had not enjoyed even amidst the Himalayas. He cried out, "This is really wonderful. Here we are actually in the midst of the snows. In India the snows are so far distant. One walks for days and days amidst the mountains to come near them. But then, these are mere hills compared with those mighty peaks that tower on the borders of Tibet. Yet this is beautiful. Come, let us make the ascent of Mont Blanc." But the guides told them that only skilled mountaineers should attempt such a feat. This was a disappointment to the Swami, but as he gazed through the telescope and saw the appallingly steep ascents, he granted that it was impracticable. However, he was bent on crossing a glacier at all costs. Without this, he felt, his visit to Switzerland would be incomplete. Fortunately, the famous Mare de Glace was within easy approach. Accordingly, several days later, the party travelled on mules to the village whence the passage over the glacier begins. The actual expedition was not so pleasant as the Swami had anticipated. It was difficult to keep his footing, even though he admired the beautiful green tints of the crevasses. They were appallingly deep and so beyond much. When the glacier proper is crossed, a very steep ascent must be climbed to reach the village above. It was here that the Swami suffered from vertigo for the first time in his life. This vertigo made it very unsafe, and he was glad when he reached the little chalet at the summit without any untoward accident. The Swami, observing the characteristics of the peasantry, remarked to his friends, "Why, these people in many of their manners and in their costumes remind me of the peasants in the hills of the Himalayas. Those long baskets that the people carry on their backs are exactly like those used in the mountainous districts of my country." It was in the Himalayas of Europe that those who were to be the founders of the Advait Ashrama and dedicate their lives to it, heard for the first time of the Swami's longing to establish a monastery in the heart of his beloved Himalayas. He said, "Oh, I long for such a monastery where I can retire from the labors of my life and pass the rest of my days in meditation. It will be a center for work and meditation, where my Indian and Western disciples can live together, and them I shall train as workers, the former to go out as preachers of Vedanta to the West, and the latter to devote their lives to the good of India." A thought, something akin to vision, crossed the minds of his disciples, and Mr. Sevier, speaking for himself and his wife, said, "How nice it would be, Swamiji, if this could be done. We must have such a monastery." At the time, it was only a passing remark, but as the months went by, that stray remark made in the heights of the Alps was seen to have been prophetic, for so deep had the idea sunk into the hearts of those disciples that the Swami's great desire was fulfilled through their practical help and cooperation. From Chamaunix, the travellers visited the village of Little St. Bernard. High above rises the famous St. Bernard Pass, on the crest of which stands the celebrated hospice of the Augustinian monks, the highest inhabited spot in Europe. At the request of Miss Muller, the party next wandered on to an interesting retreat some miles away, where a sojourn of 2 weeks was made. The Swami was at his best in this village, nestling in the Alps. On all sides rose the snow-capped peaks, all about was the silence and the peace of village life. No rude note of worldliness crept in here. It was here that the Swami enjoyed some of the most lucid and luminous spiritual moments of his life. He seemed far, far away from all worldly concerns. The world and all thought of work were forgotten entirely. He was not even the teacher, but the silent, meditating monk of old. Many times he walked silently on the mountain paths, and his friends seemed to be caught up with him in a world of meditation and of peace. One of those who were with him in this wondrous fortnight says, "There seemed to be a great light about him, and a great stillness and peace. Never have I seen the Swami to such advantage. He seemed to communicate spirituality by a look or with a touch. One could almost read his thoughts, which were of the highest, so transfigured had his personality become." 2 weeks of this quiet life completely restored the Swami. There was only one incident of a slightly disturbing character. He had been walking one morning with his friends, reciting and translating passages from the Upanishads, creating in the Alps an Indian atmosphere. On this morning, lost in reverent contemplation, he gradually dropped behind. After some short time, they saw him approaching rapidly, calling out in great excitement, "I have been saved by the grace of the Lord. I nearly fell over a precipice. I was walking along, planting my alpenstock firmly on the ground. Suddenly it broke through into a deep crevice, and I almost fell over the precipice. Certainly it was only a miracle that saved me. His friends were greatly agitated when they heard this and congratulated themselves and the Swami over his marvelous escape. Thenceforth they took special care never again to leave him alone. On the way homewards, there was a little mountain chapel. As the Swami saw it, he said quietly, "Do let us offer some flowers at the feet of the Virgin." His face shone with great tenderness, and he went forth, one of the party accompanying him, and gathered some alpine flowers. "Offer them at the feet of the Virgin," he said to Mrs. Sevier, "as a token of my gratitude and devotion." And with a strange note of religious certainty, he added, "For she also is the mother." He would have offered them himself, but feared that the fact that he was not a Christian might cause trouble. At this out-of-the-way village in Switzerland the Swami received news, which changed the course of his continental tour. It was in the form of an urgent letter from the well-known Orientalist, Paul Deussen, professor of philosophy at the University of Kiel. He had written to the Swami's London address, cordially inviting him to visit him at his residence in Kiel. The professor had been studying the Swami's lectures and utterances, and found in him an original thinker and a spiritual genius. Deeply interested as he was in the Vedanta philosophy, and having recently returned from Hindustan itself, he naturally desired to meet the Swami to discuss philosophical questions with him. The Swami therefore made plans to go to Kiel before returning to England. But his hosts insisted that he should complete his Swiss tour before going to Kiel, and arranged that he should also see something of Germany on the way. Urgent business, however, compelled Miss Muller to leave the party at Lucerne, the destination next in view. At Lucerne, visits were paid to all the places of interest, and, with the exception of Mr. Sevier, all made the ascent of Mount Rigi by the mountain railway, a fascinating experience, the view from the summit commanding one of the finest snow vistas in the world. He was now restless to proceed onwards, and so bidding farewell to his disciple, Miss Muller, he and Mr. and Mrs. Sevier journeyed to Zermatt, one of the beauty spots of Switzerland, where he hoped to climb the Kummergrat and to secure the view of the Matterhorn. But of the party only Mr. Sevier succeeded in reaching the summit, the air being too rarefied for the other two. The next move was made to Schaffhausen, where the falls of the Rhine are seen at their best. From Schaffhausen the three tourists went to Heidelberg, the center of one of the greatest German universities, where 2 days were spent. A visit to the university and the Kartel above the city was made. Then on to Koblenz. Here a halt was made for the night, and on the next day the party boarded a steamer to journey up the Rhine as far as the city of Cologne, where the travelers expected to stay several days. The Swami marveled at the great cathedral and attended a service there and visited its sanctuary. Mr. and Mrs. Sevier had planned to take Guest from Cologne direct to Kiel, but he was anxious to see the great city of Berlin. His hosts, eager to please him, made a large detour, intending not only to visit Berlin, but Dresden as well. The Swami was struck with the general prosperity of the country and with the large number of its cities built after the modern style. Berlin with its wide streets, fine monuments and beautiful parks made him compare it favorably even with Paris itself. When he was informed that their next destination was Dresden, he hesitated saying, "Professor Kuskin will be expecting us. WZ must not defer our visit longer." Accordingly the party proceeded to Kiel. A very interesting account of this visit recorded by Mrs. Sevier who, together with her husband, was also invited to be the guests of the Deussen family, is given here. "My recollection of Kiel, a town in Germany, which is beautifully situated on the Baltic, is bright with agreeable memories of a pleasant day spent in the society of Dr. Paul Kuskin, professor of philosophy in the university there, a man of rare philosophical grasp, standing foremost in the rank of European Sanskrit scholars. On hearing that the Swami had arrived at the hotel, the professor immediately sent a note requesting his company at breakfast on the following day, courteously including my husband and myself in the invitation. Punctually at 10 o'clock the next morning we presented ourselves at his house and were ushered into the library, where we received a cordial reception from Dr. and Mrs. Deussen, who were expecting us. After a few preliminary inquiries regarding the travels and plans of Swamiji, I noticed the professor directing his eyes to some volumes lying open on the table, and with a scholar's appreciation of learning, he soon turned the conversation on books. He considered the system of the Vedanta as founded on the Upanishads and Vedanta Sutras, with Shankaracharya's commentaries, some of the most majestic structures and valuable products of the genius of man in his search for truth, and that the highest and purest morality is the immediate consequence of the Vedanta. It seems, the professor added, that a movement is being made back towards the fountainhead of spirituality, a movement that will in the future probably make India the spiritual leader of the nations, the highest and greatest spiritual influence on earth. The Swami interested himself in some translations Dr. Deussen was making, and a discussion arose on the precise significance and correct understanding of various obscure passages. The former pointed out that clearness of definition was of primary, and elegance of diction of very secondary importance. The vigorous and lucid interpretations given by the Oriental exegetist with such firmness or conviction, and yet such delicacy of perception, eventually quite won over the German savant. But to return to the narration of the day spent in Kiel. Sometime during the day, the professor found the Swami turning over the pages of a poetical work. He spoke to him but got no response. When the Swami came to know of it afterwards, he apologized, saying that he was so absorbed in reading that he had not heard him. The professor was not satisfied with this explanation until, in the course of conversation, the Swami quoted and interpreted verses from the book. Dr. Deussen was dumbfounded, and like the Maharaja of Tliatri asked the Swami how he could accomplish such a feat of memory. Thereupon the conversation turned upon the subject of the concentration of the mind as practiced by the Indian yogi, and that with so much perfection that, the Swami said from personal knowledge, in that state he would be unconscious even if a piece of burning charcoal were placed on his body. At this time, there was an exhibition in Kiel, which Dr. Deussen insisted that the Swami must visit and offered to take him there. So immediately after tea, the Swami's party accompanied their host to the exhibition, and some time was spent in studying the various arts and industries of Germany. Partaking of light refreshments there, the party returned to the hotel where the Swami was staying. The professor suggested that the Swami should see the objects of interest in and about the city, and it was decided that on the next day they would all make an excursion to some of the outlying districts, notably to the famous harbour of Kiel, opened only a few days previously by the Kaiser. About 6 weeks had been spent in holiday touring, and the Swami felt that he could now take up his London work again with renewed vigour. Accordingly, he asked Mr. and Mrs. Sevier to make plans for returning immediately. Dr. Deussen had hoped that the Swami would prolong his visit so that he would have opportunities to discuss many philosophical matters with him in the quiet retreat of his own residence, where his treasure room of learning and of books would have added much to the interest of their discussions. He tried to induce the Swami to remain if only for a few days, but when he was told that the Swami was anxious to put his work on a solid basis before returning to India, which he intended to do in the near future, the professor understood and said, "Well, then, Swami, I shall meet you in Hamburg, and thence, via Holland, we shall both journey to London, where I hope to spend many happy hours with you. At Hamburg, Professor Deussen joined them. The party, with its additional member, went to Amsterdam for 3 days, during which time they visited the art galleries, the museums, and other places of interest. The Channel crossing, a most unpleasant voyage, was fortunately soon over. Professor Deussen made his home with friends in St. John's Wood, while the Swami accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Sevier to their home in Hampstead. The Swami was much improved in health and felt that he could meet the demands of his work with renewed energy and enthusiasm. Having initiated Swami Sardananda by personal example and instructions into the manner and matter of the preaching work that he would be called upon to take up, the Swami, at the repeated requests of his disciples and students of Vedanta in America, had sent him to New York at the end of June in the company of Mr. J. J. Goodwin. The sweet and gentle personality of the new teacher and his masterly exposition of Hinduism at once drew to him large numbers of men and women in America, who were attracted to the Vedanta by the other Swamis' eloquence and example, but who had not had sufficient opportunity for personal contact to become what one would call established in it. Soon after his arrival, he was invited to be one of the teachers in the Greenacre Conference of Comparative Religions, where he began his work with a lecture on Vedanta and classes on the yoga systems under the large pine tree known as the Swami's Pine, which had served as a canopy and open pulpit for Swami Vivekananda 2 years ago. At the close of the conference, Swami Saradananda was invited to lecture in Brooklyn, New York and Boston. During his tour on the continent, the Swami was delighted with the news of his brother disciples' immediate success and constantly growing influence, and to hear, from private letters, that the students' expectations of their new teacher were fully satisfied. After a few days' stay with Mr. and Mrs. Sevier in Hampstead, the Swami commenced his work by giving 2 drawing-room lectures within the first 2 weeks at Airlie Lodge, Ridgeway Gardens, the residence of Miss Muller at Wimbledon. On the first occasion, Mr. J. F. Schwam presided and the room was crowded, the majority of attendants being society ladies. The Swami spoke on Vedanta as a factor in civilization. The lecture was a great success, and it was followed by the opening of systematic classes in which the Swami gave both private and general instruction, teaching many the principles of Raja Yoga and the practices of meditation.